Good morning and welcome to the weekly media availability for the Legislative Republicans. Thanks for tuning in this early. And I'm Kim Wirtz, Communications Director for the Senate Republicans. I'll be moderating for this week's event. Joining us today are Senate Republican Leader John Braun from the 20th Legislative District, Senate Republican Caucus Chair Ann Rivers from the 18th Legislative District, House Republican Leader Representative J.T. Wilcox from the 2nd Legislative District, and Representative Ed Orcutt, also from the 20th Legislative District. Representative Orcutt is the ranking Republican on the House Finance Committee. Senator Braun, would you like to give some opening remarks?
Well, thanks, Kim. First of all, thank you everyone for being here this morning. Lots going on as we wrap up the 2021 session. We continue to work on getting our businesses safely back to work. We've had some setbacks this week, and I think once again we're seeing the governor and Department of Health look at the wrong metrics and how we safely get people back in business. Largely the same in schools, and this has lost its visibility recently. We still have a lot of kids that aren't in person in school, and we know the harm that's doing to kids around the state. And then, of course, it's the end, so we're starting to look at the budgets. We know the budgets that have been proposed by the majorities have grown by an enormous amount, and that's supported by literally dozens of new taxes. And think of that in the context of a economy that's fragile as we recover from the pandemic, and what that's going to do to the economy long term. And then the last thing I'd mention is here we are in week 14 of the session, week and a half to go, and we have yet to have a serious conversation about emergency powers. The majorities have been unwilling to reassert legislative authority in a pandemic and learn from the lessons we've all received over the last year in how best to have statutory emergency powers. So we're headed, unfortunately, and I think contrary to the wishes of the people of Washington, back into a system of one-person government here in a week and a half. So those are the things I think are top of mind as we enter the last part of session, and I will turn it over to Representative Wilcox for his opening comments.
Well, thank you very much, John, and thanks to all of you for being here. And one more time, I just have to say, I'm looking forward to the day when we're all in the same room. That will be a meaningful moment, I think, for all of us. I agree with John, and I think most of my colleagues, whether they admit it or not in the legislature, that it's time for the legislature to actually do our job and restore a functioning three-branch government after sine die. I have said many times that emergency powers are corrosive, I think, to our system of government. And it's important that we give everyone a chance to have a voice on that, especially as we've seen 3 counties go backwards. As you know, I represent a large part of rural Pierce County, and Pierce County is now going to be going backwards. I've talked extensively with Pierce County Executive Bruce Dameyer, and he's made a few points to me. First of all, we've now had, I think, around 3 months of any vulnerable person being able to get vaccinated. So in Pierce County, as across the state, if you're a vulnerable person, you've had a long time to get vaccinated if you choose to do that. So there is a difference in the danger level compared to what we were looking at a year ago. At the same time, current statistics from the Washington State Department of Health dashboard show that our hospital capacity is very strong. I think we're at about 78% of ICUs filled. And of course, Pierce County has a good deal of emergency medical capacity there, as does Whitman County and also Calais County, which shares the distinction with Pierce County of being rolled back. And Pierce County has kind of a unique distinction because of the allocations of vaccines from the state. Sadly, it's running quite a bit behind the rest of the state in terms of vaccinations. And Executive Dameyer has asked the governor and the Department of Health to increase their allocation of vaccines. And it only makes sense if you've got a county that's struggling, even though most people that are vulnerable are vaccinated. We should allocate more vaccines to those 3 counties so that they can catch up and not be put behind. There's been a great deal of editorial board support for our position that we should have some legislative oversight of emergency powers. And I saw just this morning, the Columbian featured a pretty good editorial board opinion that pointed out that we are in the bottom 5 of all states in the United States when it comes to legislative oversight of the executive under emergency conditions. And Washington State prides itself on being ahead of the pack in many cases when it comes to how the government functions. And we are sadly behind. So we will be offering legislative members of both parties from Pierce County and the other counties an opportunity tomorrow, along with the entire legislature, to vote on an 8th order motion to bring a very moderate oversight bill for executive powers tomorrow. And I would hope that Democrats in Pierce County would be highly motivated to vote for, first of all, the 8th order motion so that we can consider this bill and then vote for the bill that has been out there for some weeks, plenty of time for people to look at it. And it simply says that a majority of the legislature should be required to continue emergency powers for the governor every 60 days. And certainly that cannot be threatening to Democrats. They hold the majority. They could decide whether or not they're going to make that extension. And I would ask, especially the Pierce County Democratic members of the House, to join us in that 8th order motion. We also have a situation where the majority party is offering many opportunities to the people of Washington to pay extra taxes and fees. And I thought that Ed Orcutt, who is probably the longest serving leader in the finance arena in Olympia, to share some of his thoughts about that. So I'll just turn it over to Ed.
Thanks, JT. So I think we all know kind of where we are in session. We've gotten past all of the policy cutoffs, and what we're down to now is basically reconciling bills on concurrence and doing budgets. And along with finalizing budgets is finalizing any bills that are necessary to implement those budgets. With both House and Senate versions kind of including a capital gains income tax in their budget assumptions. I think we can assume that we're going to be seeing some movement on that fairly soon. Senate Bill 5096 is sitting in the House Finance Committee. As I'm the ranking member on that committee, I'm expecting that there's going to be a call for a Finance Committee meeting fairly soon. It's a big concern to me that we're even looking at that. I think instead of looking to raise taxes, we should be looking at tax relief. I've gone back and looked at, every time we get a revenue forecast update, we continue to hear that our revenues are growing, and part of the reason they're growing is because property taxes came in higher than we anticipated. I went back and looked at what we expected when we did the McCleary fix, how much revenue we expected to come in property tax. We're collecting $1.4 billion per year more today than what we're expecting to be collecting today in property taxes as a result of that. That's about $2.7 billion per biennium that we could be giving in tax relief and still living up to our obligations under the McCleary fix. And yet here they are looking at a $1 billion per biennium tax increase. Seems to me things are going in the wrong direction. Add to that, you remember that I was the ranking member on the Transportation Committee for a number of years. In fact, when we did the last transportation package, I was part of the negotiations as the ranking member on transportation. Really concerned about how this proposal is being put together, concerned about a lot of what's in it, but really concerned about the way it's being put together too. We heard when Representative Fye brought his proposal out and had a hearing in the Transportation Committee, he talked about all of the listening tour that they did. Unfortunately, no Republicans were invited to any of those 80+ listening sessions. Whereas when the MCC did their listening session back in 2013, All legislators were invited. In fact, all legislators from the area where they were doing one were especially invited. I know I attended at least 4 of the 10 personally, and I saw legislators from both parties at those listening sessions. So it's a little disappointing that these proposals were done without the input or without the ability of Republicans to be involved in the listening sessions, and then put out and requested that it become bipartisan, suddenly become bipartisan after it's already been put together. It's really concerning when you look at what is in the package that we're seeing, especially coming over from the Senate. 9.8 cent increase. The cap and tax proposal that's in there. They even add in an assessment on new construction. First time we've really gotten into property taxes to fund state transportation. And there's 34 different ways that they raise money for this. Some are transfers, some are good, but a lot of them are just taking more money out of the taxpayers' pockets when most taxpayers actually need some going into their pockets. We've seen the federal government do 3 different packages where they've sent out stimulus checks. And here the state is trying to take more out of their pockets instead of more into their pockets. So it is extremely concerning to see some of these things that are still alive. There's still talk about running these things. We know that they can be run last minute. We've seen it before in 2005. For those of you who were around then, remember that we were getting close to the end of session and everybody thought that transportation package was dead. And it came to life and I think passed in the last 2 or 3 days of the legislative session. So we know nothing is dead until the final gavel falls, and the taxpayers are never safe until we gavel out sine die.
Okay, with that, we will go to questions. The first one is from Leo Brine from Publicola. Go ahead, Leo.
Thanks, Kim. Hi, representatives. I was wondering, the wealth tax is also, it was moved out of the Finance Committee and into the Appropriations Committee. Are any of you interested in having a hearing for that bill?
Well, you're asking the representative who's already been through the whole process with that. As far as we had the hearing and it got exec'd out of finance. So now it would be a question of whether or not it advances across the floor. I have concerns about that. I really have a hard time believing, that if you look at the intent statement, it talks about at least one individual worth $179 billion at a 1% tax. That's $1.79 billion that they would be taxed annually. I can't believe that somebody is going to stay in this state and pay $1.79 billion annually in additional taxes above what they're already paying. Remember, if they've got that kind of value, they've got a huge amount of assets, more than likely in this state, and they're already paying huge amounts of taxes. So I'm really concerned that we would see some of those folks say, okay, I could buy $150 or $200 million resort style home somewhere else, and that's a lot less than 1.79 billion per year. So even if they don't move, you run the risk of a lot of up and coming entrepreneurs that would say, I hope to be in the billionaire class someday, but I don't hope to be in the billionaire class in the state of Washington, and they'll locate somewhere else. And we are hearing from some individuals that they don't want to come here, and that others are not looking at the state of Washington anymore. And that's without it even being passed. That's just with the threat of it being passed. And you have to understand that's the way the business community looks at things. They don't just look at things as, okay, this is what the taxes are now. What is the risk of new taxes being added on? What would those taxes be? And do I want to take that risk? Do I want to invest billions of dollars? As Amazon has invested over $100 billion in facilities and wages in our state. Do we really want to see the next entrepreneur move to another state and we lose out on the next $100 billion of investment? That's what really concerns me.
Well,
So I really don't have an interest in seeing that advance any further.
I think anybody that considers the irresponsibility of building a budget around a lot of revenue from a small number of the most portable people in the world will realize that this is not a serious proposal.
Leo, did you have a follow-up question?
No, thank you.
Okay, so I will move to Sarah Gensler from McClatchy. Go ahead, Sarah.
Thank you, Kim. Over the weekend, the Ways and Means Committee passed Senator Dinger's bill addressing the Blake decision to rules without recommendation. She explained yesterday the goal is to get that out of the Senate this week. And just based on what happened on Saturday, it doesn't seem like there's consensus on the right approach there quite yet. We heard a bit about the sticking points in the majority, and I'm curious if Senator Brown and Rivers, what's the state of those conversations? What do you see as the sticking points? And do you think it's realistic to get a bill all the way through the legislature by April 25th?
Sarah, I think that negotiations are happening regularly. There's a lot of discussion going on, not just between the negotiators, but by people who are very, very concerned on both sides of the aisle. I would say this is not a partisan issue, but I would say that the prime holdup is should there ever be a felony involved in illegal drug possession, and I think that's the largest sticking point. I mean, you've got somebody on their 6th time, they've been diverted 2-3 times. Maybe they need something a little bit stronger to give them a boost. And if you've seen any of the coverage down here in Clark County, we have a gentleman who just opened the Iron Horse Recovery Center who says that it was the interface between public safety and treatment that not only saved him, but is now allowing him to save others. So some individuals need a stronger, firmer hand, others not so much. Very, very concerned down here in Clark County. We've seen 13-year-olds get caught and released with heroin on them. So I think that that's really the felony piece is really important as it relates to the idea of what to do with individuals who are given chance after chance, but don't do anything to really make those chances work for them. I think that's the biggest. Everything else is on the table, but for some reason, that's the flag. That's where the Democrat majority has placed their flag, and no felony ever.
Yeah, I would just add, many of us have drug courts in our communities that have been very effective in helping folks break out of the cycle of substance abuse. And there's no path to drug courts unless there's a felony involved. Those drug courts are through the Superior Court. Gross misdemeanor is at the district court. So I think there's broad agreement that we ought to have some treatment programs. That's the right answer. But there also has to be some consequences and some path to get to drug court where we can insist on treatment. And I agree with Senator Rivers. That's been the sticking point. We're going to keep working on it. And as she said, I don't know this is a partisan issue. I think anybody that's serious understands this has to be dealt with before we leave. It's a little disappointing that it's taken 2 months to get to that conclusion for the majorities, but they seem to be there now, and we're working hard and in good faith to find a way to move forward.
Sarah, did you have a follow-up?
Yeah, I would like to ask Representative Wilcox, can you just explain a little bit further the potential results of a motion under the 8th order of business, what that looks like? Just some basic information on that. And I mean, if I recall correctly, I think its success would require a majority of member support. So if you could also just give insight into whether you think that support has been rallied at this point.
Okay, well, first of all, the bill itself has bipartisan support. Representative Chapman has signed on to the bill. So it's not just a Republican effort. And as I mentioned before, this is a very moderate effort that preserves the power of the majority in the House to decide whether or not the governor's emergency powers will continue. So it's not a power grab. It's not a tyranny of the minority situation. And going back to the eighth order, it is a simple majority. It's a procedural motion. Representative Drew McEwen will make the motion. It's not debatable. So there's not a lot of drama attached to it. But if 9 Democrats join the 41 Republicans, that motion will be passed. The next motion, and that allows bills to be brought to the floor based on simple majority vote of the legislature rather than going through rules or being assigned to committees by the speaker. The next motion would be to suspend the cutoff rules for that bill. And then the motion following that would be to move for immediate consideration of the McEwen bill. And that, of course, would be debatable. It would be thoroughly considered and then voted on. And as I've said, there are a number of Democratic members of the House who represent Pierce County, for example, and I think may very well feel the same way that I and other legislators do. And that is that now that we have vulnerable people vaccinated, or at the very least, they've had that opportunity, we have plenty of hospital capacity. And we are continuing to vaccinate and now vaccinating the less vulnerable people that are the demographic group that are spreading now, that we ought to look at this pandemic in a different way and allow people to make their own safe choices and prevent businesses that are just limping along from being crippled one more time.
Okay, and next in line would be Hannah Scott with Cairo Radio. Go ahead, Hannah.
Thanks, Kim. This would be, I think, for Senator Braun or Leader Wilcox, either one of you, just following up on Sarah's question about Blake. I'm curious if there's been any discussion about potentially adding something to compel treatment that's not where you're not necessarily dealing with a felony, but a discussion that often comes up is whether you have forensic navigators or someone like that where they could compel treatment. Is that any part of the discussion currently?
Well, I think rightly or wrongly, that is the only method we have to do that right now in our state, and really that we can put in place in the next, as a result of legislation, is through our drug courts. They have worked effectively and compassionately and to help folks get through this problem. We can have there may be other solutions in the future that compel treatment, but there's no other mechanism right now, and that's really the challenge. Is we can do diversion, and we've been open to diversion on initial possession charges, but eventually you have to compel folks to get treatment, and the method in our state is through the drug courts, and that's a Class C felony to get there. Got to go to the Superior Court. So I don't think there's any necessarily resistance to that, but that's a much longer term discussion. We need to start that discussion many months ago if we were going to take that path and be effective.
I've spoken with the speaker several times about this. We're both Pierce County legislators, and the truth is the leader in a lot of this has been Senator Jeannie Darnielle. There's hardly a family in the state of Washington that has not had this touch one of their members. And I've been able to observe this closely because a family member of mine has been through a drug court. And I think that person is alive today because of the fact that it became a very serious thing. There was a time period when that person was unable to obtain drugs and is now a drug counselor, a huge success story. And, we can't give up on people, and we can't just be hands off. It's a matter of compassion. And it may sound sometimes very authoritarian to say that we've got to take away someone's liberty. But in this case, when life and death and all kinds of consequences for the family members surrounding a person that is addicted is at stake, we should be very, very serious. And these discussions are ongoing in the Senate. I hope that they have progress. I'm being updated by Senate Republicans, and you will see, I think, a great deal of bipartisan concern as long as this is a serious effort that doesn't get ideological, just tries to help people.
Okay, Hannah, did you have a follow-up?
I do quickly, this again for Leader Wilcox on a separate issue. You talked a lot about Executive Dammeyer and the situation with the vaccinations and being shorted there. I'm curious, have you seen the letter that the governor has sent to the executive regarding the vaccination supply in Pierce County?
No, I haven't. I talked to Bruce about the letter that he sent yesterday, and I have not seen the response.
I'll forward it. Maybe you could follow up with me later. It lays out the vaccines that they have and that they're likely not going to get any additional.
Well, they're 10% behind King County, and it's not because they have not been administering the vaccines. It seems inexplicable to me that a large urban county that has a higher infection rate cannot be allowed to catch up in their vaccination rate when they're behind through no fault of their own that I could see.
Thank you.
Okay, next we'll go to Joe Sullivan from the Seattle Times. Go ahead, Joe.
Hi, quick question and then a broader question. Quick question, 8th order procedure, is that today or tomorrow?
That will be tomorrow. And
okay, great.
What time?
And then broader question for whoever can answer. How much contact are you having with Democratic budget writers as they go in negotiations now? What sort of discussions are you led in on? Are you being allowed any input at this point?
I have talked to Senator Rolfus a couple times on the floor in the last week, and but virtually no discussion about the budget in any significant detail. That is a majority to majority discussion, or at least from my perspective, the minorities are not being included in any meaningful way.
Yeah, that's the way I understand it too.
Joe, did you have a follow-up question?
Yeah, when we let's see, when the federal coronavirus package passed, I know there was still some question about how some of that money could be spent. And Democratic lawmakers said they don't know yet on some of those things. Have you guys seen or heard or gotten any more clarity anywhere about defined spending for some of those dollars that you didn't know when the first package came out, when the package first came out?
Yeah, I think the two areas I think that were in question were the language about whether there could be tax reductions statewide and whether that affected our ability to put money in the UI trust fund. I think that's been resolved, at least to my satisfaction, that we can do that. And then the other one I think that was questioned is whether we can put it said water infrastructure, and there's some that went to transportation specifically for culverts. There's some question about whether that would be okay. Again, near as I can tell, that has been, we're comfortable with that, or that's going to be allowable. So I don't, to my knowledge, there's no ongoing controversy there. But again, we haven't been in the middle of those discussions. So if they're considering other uses of those funds, that's a different matter we wouldn't know about.
Okay. Next, we will go to Laurel Demkovich from the Spokesman Review. Go ahead, Laurel.
Thanks, Kim. Just two quick questions. The first for Representative Wilcox. And I apologize if you mentioned this, but the emergency powers bill, is that one that has already been introduced, or is this a new proposal?
Yes, it has been introduced several weeks ago. Prime sponsor is Representative McEwen. Number two is Representative Chapman, Democrat from the 24th District. I should have written down the bill number. I don't remember, but I'm pretty sure that our staff can get it out to all of you probably while we're still talking here. But again, it has gotten attention. It's a very simple bill, and it was deliberately written so that it would appeal to the majority. It does not take away their power. It requires a simple majority of the legislature to approve 60-day extensions of the governor's basic emergency powers, which is unprovided for in our state. It is an unusual situation that a emergency can last as long as the governor says it does, or until the courts step in. And as everyone knows, the courts have been very deferential to the executive. And, people should be interested in this regardless of what party you're in or what party the governor's in, because this is something that is important in the future. It's not just about this situation. And as we've said many times, these emergency powers have never been stress tested in a major way. And it is absolutely reasonable to think that now that we've had a year-long experience, that we might want to modify the things that were, purely theoretical over the last 30 years.
I just add, we have a very similar bill sponsored by Senator Linda Wilson in the Senate. We've been pushing on that, and we very much appreciate the House Republicans are taking the lead on this, and we'll certainly support their efforts to bring emergency powers to the forefront in our discussions in this last week and a half.
The McEwen bill is 1557.
Thank you, Ed.
Wilson Bill 5039.
Okay, and Laurel, did you have any follow-up questions?
Yeah, just briefly for Senator Braun, you mentioned in the beginning that the metrics that were being used for the moving phases weren't the right metrics. Can you elaborate on that and what you think should be used instead?
Yeah, and I think Representative Wilcox alluded to the same thing in his comments. And we've seen this over and over again as we've gone through the pandemic, that you have to continue that one metric, your landscape changes over time. So early in the pandemic, we're worried about death rate, of course, but also very much related to that was case rate and hospitalization rate. Well, as we get closer and closer to full vaccination of our most vulnerable, I don't have the exact statistics on the top of my head, but I think we're around 75% of those over 65. That is where the majority of the fatalities were, right? So as we approach, completion of that vulnerable group, not surprisingly, we've seen the death rate drop pretty significantly. So my view is that at this point, when we talk about restricting mobility, closing businesses, we ought to be looking at the death rate. And now, I think the death rate right now is somewhere around 5 per day. Now that's tragic, no question about it. But there are many other things in our state where we see death rates of 5 per day. This is no longer at the high rates we've seen in the past. So and the other one that Representative Wilcox mentioned is hospitalization utilization. We have strong hospitalization availability really around the state. So the only thing that's keeping us from opening further is case rate. And you could make a very sound argument that right now, when we've largely vaccinated our vulnerable folks, where fatality risk is much, much lower, hospital availability is much, much higher, case rate is not the right metric to use now. The other two are the right metrics to use. And we ought to completely, and this is an ongoing issue, we ought to always be thinking about, are we measuring the right thing, and are we thinking about it in the larger context? And I just don't think we are. I think we've missed the real threat here, which is people dying. We want to protect our citizens, but we also know that other things, and we've talked about this lots over the last year, right? There's not just the impact of the pandemic. As tragic as it's been in many cases, there's mental health issues. We've seen suicides spike. There's other issues we have to consider. And at this point, fortunately, we, largely through vaccinations, I believe, we've been able to bring the fatality rate down. So let's rethink how we're evaluating the situation. I think if we do that, we'll see that we can open up more quickly, very safely, and reduce some of these other risks associated with the pandemic.
Okay. Chris Murphy, did you have a question? I wanted to get to you before we were finished for the day. No, I'm going to take that as a no. Senator Braun or Representative Wilcox, do you have final comments before we're finished?
I just thank you to everyone for showing up. As has been mentioned, there's a lot of things that are going to get stuffed into this last couple weeks of session. We're watching pretty closely the dozens of tax increases that are proposed and have, considerable concerns about all of those, some more than others, but we've talked largely about that. Still focused on same things we've been focused on the year. Let's get our businesses and our economy safely reopened. Let's get our kids back in school. Let's have a budget that is balanced and is sustainable and focused on the right things and not overspending or relying on proposed taxes that have real fundamental flaws in them. So and then finally, as we've talked, I think at length here, is let's rethink our emergency powers to get them right for the state of Washington. And finally, let's address the Blake decision in a real bipartisan and thoughtful way, so we don't have a public health or a public safety issue out there, and more importantly, that we take care of these folks that are struggling with these abuse issues in ways that are compassionate and thoughtful, and frankly, save lives.
Well, I would thank you all for the time, but also urge you to keep your eyes on the behind the scenes stories of all of the ways that the Democratic Party is trying to tax people in the most regressive possible way for having to commute from places where you have affordable housing to places where there's employment. And in an odd way, all of those three bills that price carbon or gas seem to be tied together. The result over the long run could be that people have to pay 60 cents a gallon more for the necessary commuting that they do to get to their jobs. I don't know that there's going to be an awful lot of drama out in the open on these things, but I think there's going to be a ton behind the scenes. And there has been some amazingly perceptive reporting on this. I was very impressed with what Paul Query did. I learned an awful lot about the behind the scenes movements in the Senate from Paul Query, and a number of others of you, I think, have been really good on this. And it's going to have a big impact, whether it happens or not, to a lot of the working people of Washington. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, and we'll see you next week.